Colleagues, we have 4 wonderful speakers for us today that have a very busy agenda. So what I would like to do is to introduce the speaker, and then after each speaker, we will have about 15 minutes of questions, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. So without further ado, we will begin with a presentation by Amber Wigadry, who is the Program Principal of Criminal Justice at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And I don't need to explain NCLS to any of my colleagues here. So with that, Amber, I will let you go ahead with your presentation, and thank you for being with us today.
Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, and members of the task force, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's meeting. As the chair mentioned, my name is Amber Wigadry and I work in NCSL's Criminal Justice Program. And if you'll advance to the next slide. This is just a brief overview of NCSL. We are the bipartisan professional organization for state lawmakers and staff across the nation, and we provide information and research on a wide range of public policy issues, including policing policy. So next slide. The first thing that I wanted to highlight for you today is NCSL's new policing legislation database. We launched this new database in June, and it contains policing legislation that has been introduced in state legislatures across the nation since May 25th of 2020. The status of bills in the database is updated daily, and new legislation is added to the database as it is identified by NCSL staff, which varies between daily and weekly at this point. I've provided the link to the database here, and you, just as a quick housekeeping thing, can always tell when new legislation has been added to the database by checking the date stamp at the top of the page. If you were to look at it now, you would see that the last update was last night. You can search the database by keyword, author, state, bill number, status, or topic. Most of those capabilities are self-explanatory, but I wanted to just take a moment to highlight search by topic. These search by topic filters are actually curated manually by NCSL staff, and you'll find definitions of each topic underneath the database module that'll give you a sort of broad idea of what other states have introduced in terms of legislation. We update those definitions as we see new and different kinds of legislation introduced in the 50 states. Next slide, please. So now I want to turn my attention to what states have been doing. As of the end of last week, 27 states and Washington, D.C. had introduced 339 new bills. 35 of those measures have now been enacted, and another 7 are awaiting executive action, with 181 that are still pending legislative action. What's notable most about these numbers is the proportion of states that have had the ability to introduce legislation since May 25th. Without COVID-19 related session delays and recesses, only 17 states would have normally been in session after the events on May 25th. So in addition to delayed sessions, special legislative sessions have also provided an opportunity for lawmakers to introduce new policing legislation. And specifically, Oregon and Minnesota also convened sessions with the intent not just to address COVID-19, but also policing issues specifically. Next slide, please. So of the 339 introduced bills that I mentioned, I also said that 35 of those have been enacted. This represents action in 15 states and also Washington, D.C. And on this slide, I've also provided a high-level summary of the topics that have been addressed by those enactments. I'm going to do a little bit more detail and give you some examples of some of those recent actions in the next slides. So next slide, please. A fair number of states have proposed legislation that would require new data tracking of various aspects of police community interactions. And related to this, states have also created new study committees, not unlike this one, or other state bodies to review existing data and information and then to make recommendations to legislatures on policy going forward. Rhode Island and Louisiana each created new task forces, and Oregon and Georgia actually created or established new committees to oversee police work. Related to data collection and dissemination, the new Colorado law requires reporting of data on use of force incidents, including incidents where an officer unholsters their weapon, and then also reporting of general police contact data, which includes demographic information in addition to other information. This data is required in Colorado to be posted publicly in a new database that is to be launched in the next year or two. New York has also recently required new data tracking and reporting, but that law only addresses arrest-related deaths. Next slide, please. There's also been a focus on use of force in particular, and not just data related, but addressing use of force directly. This has included changing statutory standards for physical use of force and also deadly force, restricting the specific kinds of force that can be used, including chokeholds or other less lethal means of force. Particularly aspects that have been addressed include projectiles, less lethal projectiles, and also use of chemical weapons of some kind. 5 states have enacted laws addressing use of force. The Colorado law is by far the broadest, updating their use of force standards, providing guidance on when force can be utilized, and putting in place requirements such as verbal warnings prior to the use of deadly force. All 5 states have also addressed neck restraints or chokeholds in some manner, with at least 2 states also restricting the use of training on those maneuvers. Some states have prohibited the maneuvers altogether, while other states have restricted their use to circumstances when deadly force would otherwise be utilized. Next slide, please. States have also addressed use of force by creating affirmative statutory duties to intervene in excessive force situations, and also duties to report incidents of excessive force. Colorado and Oregon both took action to create this affirmative statutory duty to intervene. New Mexico and Colorado addressed limiting state immunity provisions and other defenses in excessive force cases or failure to intervene cases. And Colorado and New York also require officers now to provide medical assistance or aid to any individuals that are under their custody due to arrest or otherwise in their custody. Next slide, please. Also related to use of force are state actions to create a framework for independent state level investigations and independent prosecutions. Iowa and New York recently authorized state level agencies or officials to investigate and also prosecute officer involved offenses. In Iowa, the Attorney General was actually unable to take action even if intervention was not requested by local officials. The state level official could then step in. Next slide, please. States have also provided stronger guidance for required trainings, and this affects both annual trainings for officers to maintain their certification and initial trainings required for officer certification on the front end when they're first employed. Colorado has required training on all of their new use of force standard changes for every certified officer in the state. Oregon and Utah didn't require new training, but specifically banned training officers on the use of neck restraints. And Iowa's new law requires de-escalation training with a focus on less lethal and alternatives to use of force, and also requires annual bias prevention training. Next slide, please. Recent enactments have also provided specific guidance as to what types of serious misconduct would require that an officer be decertified or suspended in a state, in the states that have certification processes, which is the majority. These new enactments provide guidance on when decertification is mandatory under state law, or when it is within the discretion of a state regulatory agency or post board. 5 states have enacted new laws that address this topic, and some of those new laws also address providing broader access to certification information. Next slide, please. Requiring the use of body-worn cameras has also been addressed in the last 6 weeks in 3 states. Colorado, New Mexico, and New York all now require broad adoption of the technology on a statewide basis, with varying timelines for rollout and which officers are included in that mandate. These new laws also provide robust regulation and guidance on the use of these devices. Next slide, please. Finally, related to the database, I wanted to highlight that the database also tracks executive orders. 3 other statewide bodies were created by executive order to study policing policies. But I also, in particular, wanted to highlight the Connecticut order here because it actually makes substantive changes related to use of force, community engagement, demilitarization of police departments, and also body-worn cameras. Next slide, please. Up to this point, I've addressed legislative enactments that have been put in place in the last 6 weeks. A number of other topics have also been addressed by pending legislation in the database. But for now, I just want to take a few minutes to provide a broader overview of state level policing policy. Outside of just the last 6 weeks, legislative interest was most recently peaked on the topic of policing following the events in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. In the following 6 years after that, lawmakers addressed a number of policing issues, including some of those listed on these slides. This is what I would identify as some of the legislative trends or areas of interest following 2014. Legislative actions in both the last 6 years and the last 6 weeks collectively has expanded state level involvement in and oversight of policing issues. And so I just wanted to take a minute to do a quick state of the states by the numbers to give you an idea of some of the recent state actions and the effects on policing that exist at the national level. So if you would advance to the next slide, please. So the first is citation in lieu of arrest. All 50 states have adopted a citation in lieu of arrest law. These laws provide a broad framework generally for officers to limit the use of jails and also the booking process. Use of citation in lieu of arrest, in addition to these broad framework laws, is also controlled by department policy, which is an area where we've seen a lot of recent change in light of COVID-19. The state legal framework was already in place, allowing departments to reduce the use of arrests and increase their use of citations. And we saw higher utilization of citation in lieu of arrest to reduce jail populations in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, 27 states and DC have required training to improve responses for individuals who may have mental health, substance use, or behavioral health disorders, recognizing that many officers haven't received adequate training for these encounters that they are involved in as part of their initial certification process. 21 states have required data collection of demographic information for motor vehicle stops. And 15 states have created procedures to improve transparency and integrity of investigations into officer-involved deaths or incidents of excessive force. Next slide, please. 15 states require reporting or data collection on those use of force incidents as well, recognizing that there is limited data that is currently available at the national level. 13 states and Washington, D.C. have appropriated funding for police departments to support the use of body-worn cameras. Those appropriations have gone towards equipment purchases, also allowing for hiring of personnel to manage the data or for data costs associated with body-worn cameras. 12 states have required training relating to cultural or racial diversity or differences. They've also required training on the prohibition of racial profiling, training to raise awareness of bias amongst officers, and also specifically supervisor training to detect or effectively respond to bias-based behavior. And then 12 states have requirements or guidelines for establishing crisis intervention teams. And I will say that SIT teams is by far the most prominent model that's been addressed by legislation, but there have certainly been very recent enactments and legislative interest in other models as well. Legislative enactments have supported pilot programs or appropriated funds to expand policing alternatives and to pilot some of those alternatives. This includes police partnership models and also non-law enforcement responses that prioritize instead responses from social workers or mental health professionals in lieu of law enforcement. Next slide, please. And then finally, 11 states have supported the duty to intervene. Creating an affirmative statutory duty to intervene, as I mentioned, is sort of a new concept within the last 6 weeks, but at least 11 other states have laws that have addressed the federal constitutional duty to intervene and related state liability concerns. 10 states have required independent investigation of police-involved incidents by a state agency, the Attorney General, or other outside source from outside the department where the event occurred. 9 states and Washington, D.C. restrict or prohibit NIC restraints at this point, and at least a handful of those also prohibit or restrict training on the use of those restraints. And 8 states require that at least some law enforcement officers utilize body-worn cameras on a statewide basis. Additional information on broad statewide policy can be found on NCSL's website. We have a law enforcement overview page that lists out some of these statutory citations for that brief run through that I just did. I'd also be happy to provide additional information that might be of interest to members of the work group. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee might have at this point related to the material that I just covered.
Thank you very much. Delegate Davis. Just wait a second to be unmuted. There you go, Delegate Davis.
All right, thank you. Ms. Widgery, thank you so much for that presentation. I have a question about accountability. Could you speak generally regarding any jurisdiction who is making direct law or responses to holding people accountable? I mean, we have lots of laws, but I think accountability is the real question. So if you could speak on that generally, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. I think that there are a lot of proposed new laws addressing accountability for officers. We have some, I mean, previous to the last 6 weeks, I would say the accountability measures we had in place were really focused on independent investigation, independent prosecution, and then general reporting requirements and collection of data. More recently, though, we've had state legislation that requires specific kinds of accountability, really addressing putting guidance in place for certain situations, defining what qualifies as serious misconduct, what sort of discipline would be authorized or required in certain instances, and then also addressing certification issues as well. Colorado is probably one of the best examples of that, or Iowa also addressed officer certification, discipline, and accountability following instances where there was, an officer involved use of force or other. But I would say broader state roles and accountability are a much more recent thing in terms of legislation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We'll have Delegate Moon and then Delegate Schlega. Delegate Moon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to follow up on your discussion about the crisis intervention alternatives you're seeing in the states. Has anyone you're looking at proposed something that would scale this up in some way that makes it more than just a token? And I ask that because we have pilots for this sort of thing. My own county has it, but just as a percentage of calls that we're asking police not to respond to, and we're going to send someone else, I don't see that we've done much other than, a pilot here and there, a couple staff people doing that. So that's the real question. And then second, how are people proposing to pay for all this stuff, like the body cams and what have you that you're seeing? Any trends would be useful. Thank you.
Yep. So Madam Chair, Delegate, to answer your question, in terms of scaling, I haven't seen anything on a statewide basis yet requiring alternative responses. I've seen state support for some of those sort of localized programs. Some of this is also tied to 911 law and how 911 systems are funded or have the capacity to incorporate alternative responses. There are some states that have broader crisis lines that you can sort of call as an alternative, but I think the key is really connecting those two services, 911 and the alternative crisis lines together. I know that Harris County, Texas has had some success with tying the two together. You can call 911 and instead get an alternative response that doesn't involve law enforcement. I believe Charleston, South Carolina, they have a tri-county region area that's working on that same thing, but I haven't seen it scaled on a state level basis yet. But there's a lot of interest there, and I think that we might see it coming up, but I just haven't seen anything yet. In terms of fiscal support for body cameras or alternative responses, most police funding comes either from the federal level or the local level. States are generally responsible for appropriations for state police. And so legislative appropriations have funded body cameras directly for state police officers, state patrol, highway patrol. And then there have been grant programs for local law enforcement officers. California, for example, I believe shortly after, it was like 2015, had their community policing legislation that provided multi-million dollars to create a grant program to fund sort of a series of things, including body cameras. That was one of the opportunities for locals to use that grant program to purchase some of this equipment or to implement other community policing alternatives. But again, a statewide grant program for a limited number of jurisdictions to implement body-worn camera programs or other alternative to policing programs. So not, you know, the state plays a limited role to some extent in terms of funding some of these things, but can sort of push the initial innovation or pilot programs. But I think, you know, your sort of initial question and assessment is accurate, that there's not a broad state role in funding a lot of these things.
Delegate Schlega.
Thank you so much. Amber, thanks for your presentation. I just have two quick questions. You mentioned use of force reporting, and in Maryland, we also have use of force reporting, but it's just a number. There's no details. Can you tell us, do the other states give you details on those reports, or is it, again, because of personnel records, just a number?
So I would say there's definitely more detailed reporting coming. Colorado's new law requires a multitude of things in the use of force reporting, including officers' names that were directly involved, bystanding officers, perceived demographics, generally an overview of circumstances involved in the event, whether an officer pulled a weapon, what that looked like, what the circumstances were. There's sort of a whole codified list of factors that have to be reported out. So I would say that in recent 6 weeks and also recent years, that reporting is getting much more detailed. I'd be happy to share, we have some 50 state information on what mountain kinds of information is reportable. Sometimes it is just that number, but increasingly we're seeing more detailed reporting required.
Okay, and finally, you went through a number of policy statutes by the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Many of those things you reported, Maryland does. So you said like 12 states. Can you tell, you know, can you give us the information, or is it on your website to say 12 states including Maryland, or, you know, that type of information?
Absolutely. I'll follow up with Claire and send the sort of state maps, if you will, with citations for each of those by the numbers stats, and give you the information, because some of it's online and some of it's just research that I've done to put together some of those counts on trends. So I'll follow up.
Okay. It'd be nice to know, because like I said, I know some of the things you put up there, Maryland does, but I'm not on judiciary. So, you know, that more detailed information, I don't know off the top of my head. Thank you.
Okay, Amber, thank you very much. I don't believe there are any other questions, so we are respectful of your time. Appreciate it. You are welcome to stay with us for the rest of the presentations, or if you have to hop off, we completely understand that. So thank you again. Next, Lori Robinson is going to present to the work group. Ms. Robinson is the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason University, and has been involved in the national criminal justice policy for more than 3 decades. Among her many accomplishments, she served as co-chair of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. She currently serves as chair of the board of directors of the Council on Criminal Justice, a new national bipartisan think tank and invitational membership organization created to advance understanding of the criminal justice policy challenges facing the nation and build consensus for solutions based on facts, evidence, and principles of justice. Ms. Robinson, welcome, and thank you for presenting to the work group today.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to be here and for that introduction. I'd like to talk to you briefly about 2 things this afternoon. First, some of the key principles in the 21st Century Policing Task Force report that you mentioned. And secondly, where I think we are in terms of policing a change in this country and some of the challenges that I see before us. First, some brief background about the task force. It was appointed by former President Obama shortly after Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, Missouri, in late 2014. And our mission was not to delve into the specific incident that occurred in Ferguson or any other specific occurrence, but to identify best practices on building bridges of trust between law enforcement and communities. Ours was an 11-member task force consisting of individuals from law enforcement, civil rights leaders, academics, and young activists. And we organized our report around 6 pillars: community trust and legitimacy, policy oversight and technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, and the final pillar on officer safety and wellness. We held 7 hearings around the country, and we heard from over 120 witnesses. Somewhat surprisingly to me, considering the diverse group that we had, we were actually able in developing our recommendations to come to consensus on every issue that we addressed. So we had no dissents in the report that we developed. We came together around 59 recommendations, and in a pretty short time period, the president only gave us 2 months to do this. We presented a report to him over 100 pages in early March of 2015. So let me turn now to some of our central recommendations. A key theme that actually runs throughout the report is the need to build community trust through fair, impartial, and respectful policing. And to accomplish this, we said that law enforcement needs to embrace a guardian rather than a warrior mindset. It doesn't mean that a warrior approach is not needed in some circumstances, certainly in dealing with let's say, a violent drug gang or a terrorist incident. But the idea here is that police should not be an occupying force in a community. Instead, they should be protectors and guardians of the citizenry. This is actually a concept that goes back to Plato's notion that guardians are those who are responsible for protecting the democracy. We also called for police departments to embrace procedural justice in their interaction with citizens. That's really about fundamentally treating people with dignity and respect, and also giving them what's called voice in encounters with law enforcement, which is a chance to tell their side of the story, something you'd want if you were stopped for speeding, for example. And it might be that you were racing to the hospital because of an emergency. We also said that policing agencies should establish a culture of transparency and accountability. For example, collecting data in areas like agency use of force is something that the prior witness mentioned, Amber alluded to, and sharing it regularly with citizens on the agency website. We also thought it was important for departments to annually survey their communities for, in effect, customer feedback to find out how citizens feel about how the department is doing. And we urge that this be done by neighborhood or zip code, so you're not aggregating together responses from the well-to-do part of town with those from, let's say, poorer communities. Turning to the area of policy and oversight, we said agencies should articulate and make public clear policies on use of force, and ideally that those policies be put together with input from the communities themselves. And that training in this area should emphasize de-escalation and alternatives to arrest or summons. One area, of course, of continuing controversy, and again, Amber alluded to this, concerns how officer-involved shootings or deaths are investigated and prosecuted. This issue, by the way, prompted probably our most extended debates and liveliest debates in the task force. Our final recommendation was that we said what are needed here are external and independent investigations of these cases. We did not think that a department could investigate itself and that that could be credible. We also felt that external and independent prosecutions are needed rather than having the local district attorney handle these. And our rationale here was pretty straightforward. We felt that in order to be credible to the public, which is often skeptical, of course, an agency cannot investigate itself, and that the credibility of the justice system and the appearance of justice really require an unbiased arbiter. Now, turning to the area of community policing and crime reduction, the task force said that a department's primary approach should be based on engagement with citizens to co-produce public safety. So what did we mean by that? Well, the police department and the community, we said, should really be jointly identifying problems and then collaborating on implementing solutions. So departments, we said, should build partnerships with churches, with schools, with community groups, with social services, and other stakeholders. And a key here is positive engagement with youth. So agencies should look, we said, for multiple opportunities for working with kids. And related to that, the task force felt strongly about ending police involvement in school discipline. Too often, we felt police over-involvement in discipline has contributed to the school to prison pipeline. Now, turning to another important area, we said new approaches are needed in law enforcement education and training, specifically expanded and more effective training, not just for recruits, but throughout law enforcement careers. So we called for enhanced training in areas ranging from de-escalation and implicit bias and procedural justice. And as a priority, and I know this has come up several times now, in handling individuals with both mental illness and mental disabilities. We know that people with untreated serious mental illness are 16 times more likely than others to be involved in fatal police encounters. And what we urged back when our report came out was that the crisis intervention training, the CIT training that's been mentioned this afternoon, be given not just to special units, but that some form of that be given to every officer because they're going to be encountering individuals when they're out on the beat. And it's very imperative that they be able to recognize and not overreact to behavior in individuals, and which is oftentimes led to very tragic results. We also called for training on interpersonal social interaction skills. We know that police academies really excel at giving young recruits technical training on firearms, on driving, but there's little focus on how to actually talk to people and interact with them, something that police are called on to do every day, and it's a crucial skill. There's recently published research confirming that one evidence-based training model is a program called T3, which stands for Tact, Tactics, and Trust. It's been pilot tested in several jurisdictions, can actually help in reducing use of force. So that is a very fast run through on just a few of the very key principles in our report. And I know our time is limited, but I want to talk now briefly about where I think we are today. I think that Ferguson, as again Amber alluded to, has had a tremendous impact in change in a number of areas. She focused on state legislative change. I also think that we've seen in policing leaders in the country far more receptivity to change. in these 6 years. Just a couple of things I would mention here. In 2016, one of the major policing leadership groups, the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, undertook a very comprehensive examination of use of force policies and released a groundbreaking set of 30 guiding principles on use of force. The following year, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is the largest policing leadership group in the world, joined with the Fraternal Order of Police, the country's largest union, and 9 other law enforcement organizations to issue their own separate consensus policy on use of force, more modest than the prior one I mentioned from PERF, but important because they had taken it up and because of the reach of those organizations. And we know from research that some revisions in use of force policies are having an impact, though clearly more needs to be done. Research by the National Police Foundation, which is a research group, found that from 2015 to 2017, this is research from the largest police departments, which are in the Major City Chiefs Association, found that 39% had changed their use of force policies and revised their training to incorporate de-escalation approaches. And within that group that had made those changes, officer-involved shootings had dropped by 21%. Now, again, more needs to be done, but I think it shows a direction that we need to go. So there are a lot of other examples, but I think a relevant question to ask now, what are some of the key challenges to further progress? And I just want to note 2. First, as is clearly evident, policing in this country is very highly decentralized. We know there are 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies, and fully half of those are very small. 9,000 of those have 10 or fewer sworn officers. So, of course, that makes it very challenging when those small agencies have less capacity, as an example, to carry out specialized training. A second point, while I address the fact that there has been buy-in for change, I do think among leaders in the field, I think that buy-in from rank and file officers is a tougher sell, but it will be critical, and addressing culture change, as in any institution, is a more difficult area. Some ways to take this on certainly are through training and supervision, but I think a key step that also needs attention is to focus on recruitment and hiring of the next generation of young recruits coming into policing. So to wrap up, there are obviously a host of issues that need to be addressed and substantial challenges involved, but I remain an optimist that we can make progress on what truly are fundamental questions that are confronting our democracy. So again, thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And Delegate Barnes will start with the first question here.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And thank you, Lori, for your presentation. I just had a couple of questions, and I appreciate the research and the study that you guys have done. But can you tell me through data, what police departments around the country is implementing any of these things that you guys have researched?
At the end of the Obama administration, there were 15 police departments that were engaged with the White House in implementing the key recommendations in the report. As in any change of administration, that work came to a halt when administrations changed. but my work with the policing field, I am certainly aware that there are, I would say, hundreds, if not more, police departments around the country that are and have implemented many of the recommendations from the report. I hear this whenever I attend conferences and meetings with police chiefs. We never intended that any department would implement all 59, since some of these are recommendations, let's say, to the research arm of the Justice Department about studies to be undertaken and so on. But there's been wide acceptance of many of the recommendations in the field.
Yeah, I was just concerned as you went through some of them, like community trust, social interaction and skills, the mental health, and looking at this civil unrest that we have today, which made me question how many are actually implementing some of the things and the recommendations that you guys had suggested. My second question is, looking at where we are today, what would be your recommendation when you talk about defunding the police?
I think that that's a very good question. I would certainly not recommend abolishing police departments, because serious and violent crime cannot, in my view, be dealt with by social workers and people who have no training in dealing with perhaps violent individuals. But I do think that the defunding conversation is raises a series of important questions which we should step back and consider, which come down to this. We need to ask, what kinds of behavior do we want to use the power to arrest for? What do we need? What kinds of behavior do we want to use criminal law for? And what kinds of things do we want the police to be used for? What kinds of work do we want to separately assign to other parts of government or social service agencies that are not part of government? I think these are very important conversations to be having, and they've really been prompted by the defund police community, if you will. And I think that's a set of healthy conversations to be having.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Schlega.
Thank you, Vanessa, Delegate Atterbury, and thank you, Laurie, for being here. A similar question to what I asked Amber. Do you have any Maryland specific information? You made some very broad statements and policy recommendations. For instance, you said that the law enforcement doesn't get trained on talking to people. And I can tell you just this week I had a great update from the Baltimore County FOP, where they specifically said they have training on de-escalation and these kinds of conversational skills that they're teaching their officers. So my question to you would be, are your comments just very general, or have you looked at the Maryland Training Commission policies? Or are you just kind of giving us your big overview without any Maryland specifics?
Ma'am, I am at this point in my career, a part-time professor at a state school with no even research assistant. The task force I served on was disbanded a number of years ago. So I have no capacity to research any state at this point. These are general comments, and I'm delighted to hear that they're doing that, but I am basing my comments on the conversations I have had with a number of states, and I'm thrilled to hear that that's going on. That's great. I certainly know that the de-escalation training is going on in lots of places, but I did not know that the kind of interactive social skills training is going on, and that's terrific. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you.
And I'll just remind my colleagues and anyone who is joining us virtually that we are getting national perspectives today to help us kind of think outside the box and creatively. We've already heard from MPTC, and we are going to get some information from them. And what we heard from them a couple weeks ago, or whenever that meeting was that, you know, some folks might be doing de-escalation training in Howard County or in Baltimore County, but they might not be doing that out on the shore or in a different county. So what we know is that we don't have a statewide collective system for training. Everyone is not on the same page. That's what we know for a fact. And so it's up to this body to determine whether or not we want everyone to be on the same page. And I'm sure if there are specific questions for MPTC, they have gotten some information back to us, but we can get you know, information about specific counties and cities and municipalities on what exactly they are doing. Delegate Davis, did you have a question? I'm just looking in here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Robinson, I'd like to ask you the same question that I proposed to the last speaker. We're tasked with creating policy, but what we've learned is that policy without accountability or enforcement is just a suggestion. And we've got lots of suggestions going on, especially with MPTC. So I'd like for you to speak about your experience with what people are doing nationally regarding enforcement of these laws or holding people accountable to the laws. Thank you.
Yeah, Delegate Davis, I think that is a very, very important point to be making. And I think that there are, of course, a number of ways that accountability can occur. And some of it really has to occur at the local level by citizens who are paying attention to what how local police are actually engaging and working with the community. So I think that, for example, the way that we envisioned, as I talked about the co-production of public safety, that the relationship that's established by police departments and agencies with community groups and their involvement on an ongoing basis, it's not a one-time type of thing, it is part of what it really matters there. And they're working with local elected officials as well as state level officials is really key as well, because of course police chiefs are appointed by and large by either city managers or local elected mayors. And I think at times people tend, not you all, but members of the public tend to forget that. And that's an important and key thing as well. So that involved citizens are a very key part of this. But beyond that, I do think that there are important issues here relating to, for example, questions about, for example, having review timelines of review of certain reforms that are put into place, that there would be a review after a year or 2 years of certain facets of those. You might want to incorporate something like that into your legislation that you're considering, so that there could be a chance to go back and consider whether they have been effective or whether changes need to be made in them, and to hear feedback about them, whether it's on use of force approaches or on the notion of independent prosecutions or whatever it might be, to go back and as part of that, I think getting community feedback would be critical.
Thank you.
Okay, at this time, I would like to thank Lori, and if you could stick around, if anyone has any more questions, we'll have to come back. And Sam, I have to apologize to you. Our presenter, Lucy Lang, has to leave. So if she could just come on now and give some brief remarks, and then we will go back to the order. So I apologize to you, Sam. So I will go introduce you really quickly. So Lucy Lang is Director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, a think tank for prosecutors and communities across the United States. Ms. Lang writes and speaks widely on prosecution and criminal legal reform and teaches those issues in New York State prisons. She previously served as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, where she investigated and prosecuted violent crimes, including domestic violence and homicides, and served as special counsel for policy and projects and executive director of the Manhattan DA Academy, a resource for professionals working at the intersection of law and public policy. Thank you, Ms. Lang, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you and apologies to Sam. This does mean, though, that you are all saving the best for last. Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, and members of the task force for allowing me to come speak to you about this critically important piece of the puzzle with this esteemed panel. The prosecutor's role, of course, in all of this is to, where possible, assure that there is appropriate accountability. And so over the course of 2015, my organization at John Jay convened a working group of about 50 different stakeholders, including prosecutors, police chiefs, advocates, and a number of families who've lost loved ones to police violence. Next slide, please. You can see that some of the names of the families we work with you will heartbreakingly recognize, including Sean Bell, Anthony Baez, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, and others. The mothers, fathers, and sisters of these tragically lost lives were critical to the work that we did in developing a set of best practices for prosecutors in ensuring appropriate community response to officer-involved fatalities. Next slide, please. I show this picture because I think that it's a good example of what the kind of community involvement that Professor Robinson was talking about can look like. And this is a bit of a circuitous and really quite heartbreaking story. John Choi, the elected district attorney of Ramsey County, Missouri, was the district attorney of the district in which Philando Castile was shot and killed. Philando Castile had been stopped no fewer than 50 times by police prior to the time that he was stopped and ultimately killed behind the wheel of his car. The district attorney of his district was able to bring charges against the officer who shot and killed him. And ultimately, the officer was acquitted after trial. And there are important lessons to be learned from that about some of the challenges of prosecuting these kinds of cases. Amongst the things that were discovered in the course of the investigation, though, were that Philando had actually taken a driving certification course as part of a program the district attorney had established in the years prior to his murder to try to help people clear their licenses. And of course, we know that huge numbers of these cases occur during traffic stops. They're incredibly dangerous and fraught encounters. And so that was an example of an effort the district attorney had made to take preventative measures, but unfortunately, to no avail. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see a picture of the district attorney seated with the Castile family after the unfortunate acquittal in the case. But their relationship is truly an example of the kind of communication and transparency that we want to see and very rarely do see in these kinds of cases. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Working together over the course of about a year, the working group put together a toolkit. And of course, it is highly variable for all of the reasons that the previous speakers have laid out, that we're talking about widely different law enforcement agencies and huge numbers of them, that we're talking about very different statutory schemes in many states. As a general matter, I think the working group came to the conclusion that where possible, it is preferable for the prosecuting agency to be one that is somewhat removed from local law enforcement. And as someone who served for many years as a prosecutor, I worked incredibly closely with the police department. And even in cases where prosecutors are able to be absolutely objective, even the appearance of perhaps an unthorough investigation undermines the community trust in the prosecutor's office and in the outcome of the investigation. So we designed a set of step-by-step protocols that we have distributed to prosecutors' offices across the country in an effort to encourage them to undertake some of these really far overdue changes that are at their core about community prosecution and how prosecutors' offices engage with their local communities. Next slide, please. I invite you to take a closer look at the before and after flowcharts that we created as part of our working group work. But the essence of them really, and this is all available at prosecution.org. And I would be thrilled for you to encourage your local prosecutors' offices to adopt the parts of these that they may have not yet adopted. But what they are truly about in their core are communication and transparency. And far too often what happens in these cases, we learned this over and over from the family members we spoke with, is that the police department sort of closes ranks, and then the prosecutor's office, in their effort to protect the investigation, and sometimes not out of malice, but purely out of a kind of cultural practice of keeping investigations secret, the prosecutor's office also appears to kind of close ranks. As a result, the family, the community, everyone who is rightly heartbroken by these tragedies feels totally shut out and has no trust in the overall integrity of the system. And so we've set forth a number of suggestions about how and when these kinds of investigations should be undertaken. It does involve a very important element of procedural justice and encouraging an open conversation at a time that is incredibly emotionally fraught for everyone involved. So this is not an easy undertaking, but we felt that the working group that we put together was an example of the kind of thing that states can do. And actually afterwards, Minnesota undertook a similar model where they brought together a number of families along with their local police chiefs and prosecutors to collectively agree on a set of protocols that the local prosecutors would adopt. Next slide, please. Please feel free to follow our work at prosecution.org or on social media. Next slide. There is a data checklist that enumerates the various materials that prosecutors should be sure to gather immediately after an officer-involved critical incident occurs. That this is a sort of best practice in investigating these sorts of cases. Next slide. And it includes an investigative checklist. Part of the challenge here, of course, is that in some jurisdictions, especially in smaller jurisdictions, we found that police departments had a cultural tendency to refuse to cooperate with prosecutors' offices. And one thing that seems to make that better is encouraging the state attorney general or someone who does not have daily contact with the local police department to have jurisdiction over those matters. Next slide, please. The state statutes, of course, are highly variable, and I appreciate some of what was laid out by Amber about the important new legislation that's passed. But these are part of what make it very difficult for these cases to be prosecuted. The reasonable officer standard is a very high standard, and there are good reasons, in part, why that standard exists, but perhaps it goes too far in protecting certain kinds of conduct, including what we saw perhaps in the Castile case. Next slide, please. We also generated a set of use of force policy guidelines. Many of these have been enacted in jurisdictions all over the country legislatively, or even as a matter of policy and practice in local departments. Next slide, please. So I would love to take a question or two if folks have them, but I am honored to be a part of the conversation. And I think that the important thing that I have to offer is an example of how collaboratively different stakeholders can work together to develop these sorts of policies. And that is really what I would encourage every community who cares about this issue, which I believe in my heart is every community in the United States right now. So thanks very much for your time and inclusion.
Thank you. And I believe Delegate Fisher has the first question.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was waiting to be unmuted. Thank you, Ms. Lang, for your presentation. My question, I have two for you. I think something that our work group and our state's going to be struggling with is where prosecutors fit in looking into cases in their own counties. We do have counties like Montgomery County in our state and Howard, they switch that off, but that systematically, in my opinion, may not be enough for a statewide consistency in investigation. I would like to know from your work, either are there other states or what you would recommend when it comes to investigating police incidents. I think there's a lot of different opinions across the board about that dynamic and who should be investigating what. So I would love for you to answer that. And then my second question is, I think an idea that's been floating around and I would love your perspective on is, I think there's obviously issues with the reasonable officer standard, but in that, should there be a criminal code that is applied directly to officers when they have use of force, not just a use of force statute, but making those elements for prosecutors to meet actually attainable? So those are my two questions.
Thank you, Delegate. I think that as to the second question, they should, and we are starting to see some of that happen in some jurisdictions. And as to the first part of the question, my own view on it is that it's preferable for a distinct body to be the prosecutor. And I think that New York State is a good model for this. There was an executive order in 2015 by which the authority was invested in the Attorney General rather than in local prosecutors. I will say that unit has not been terribly effective to date. And part of it is the challenges with the deficiencies of the statute, which you point to in the second part of your question. But that said, it has resulted in a greater degree of transparency. And I think it has the potential over time to really increase the public trust. I think that it's too soon to say whether the switching of jurisdiction practice that some counties are undertaking is effective. I think that the question to my mind is as much, are appropriate investigations being conducted, as do people see and believe that appropriate investigations are being conducted? And so I'm not sure that it matters, that it's so much a question of whether that structure works as whether that county who is taking responsibility for it is communicating kindly, compassionately in a procedural just way, is transparent about their findings. It demonstrates that they have the requisite or taking the requisite degree of care in undertaking their investigation.
Okay, thank you. I have the last question for you because I know you need to leave. What would you say? So some prosecutors might make the argument that, you know, they were elected, and so the community has given them the authority and the trust in them to prosecute, and so turning that over, you know, they don't want to turn that over to an independent agency. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, well, I think that what I would advocate more than creating an independent and appointed agency is vesting authority in another prosecuting actor. So I think the Attorney General model is preferable and sort of solves for that problem. In New York, that was a decision that was made by the elected governor, and the authority was given to the elected Attorney General. So I understand the concern from a local perspective, and I think that it's certainly worth analyzing on a state-by-state basis. But based on what we have seen, the very few numbers of cases that in which we have seen prosecutions, I think that it's preferable to come down on this other model. You know, there are 1,000 people killed by police annually, and over the past 15 years, about 100 of them have been prosecuted, and only half of those have been ultimately convicted. So we're talking about a really, really tiny number of folks who are being held accountable. Now, of course, there's a wide range of circumstances in those kinds of cases, but it seems unrealistic to think that over 15 years, that few officers being held accountable is an appropriate outcome. So thank you so much for your time and including me in the conversation. And I'm happy to cede the floor to the brilliant Sam Sinyawe.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Sam Sinyawe, who I stalked on Twitter. Sam is a policy analyst and data scientist with the Human Rights Data Analyst Group. He works with communities of color to fight systematic racism through cutting-edge policies and strategies. Sam has supported movement activists across the country to collect and use data as a tool for fighting police violence through the Mapping Police Violence System, and to advance comprehensive policies to address this issue through the Campaign Zero program. Previously, he worked at Policy Link to support communities in building cradle-to-career systems of support for low-income families, and he graduated from Stanford in 2012. So with that, I will turn it over, and thank you very much for being patient with us and letting in our change of schedule here.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm gonna just level set. I know we've been through a lot of presentations and there's a lot of information, but I wanna ground us in the data because so much of this is thinking about how are the policies that need to happen in this moment, one, at the scale of the problem, and two, evidence informed, data informed, as to the biggest levers of change that can address this issue right now. And so if we could go to the next slide. So in thinking about this work, there are sort of two broad buckets of work that need to happen in order to address this fundamental systemic issue of police violence. And the way that we think about this, and again, this has been called many different things, but the way that we talk about this is, one, there is an area of work that's about reducing the power of the police to cause harm. And this involves a range of things. This involves more restrictive use of force standards that can ban things like chokeholds and strangleholds and particularly harmful tactics, no-knock raids being another one of those. It also involves building in place the accountability structures that can enforce those standards so that when officers violate those rules, that they can actually be held accountable, that there aren't barriers to holding them accountable in statewide law enforcement officer Bill of Rights laws or local police union contracts, and that there are sufficient community input and oversight in that process to ensure that the type of accountability and enforcement of those rules is consistent with community sentiment. The second bucket of work is around shrinking the role of the police. So this is consistent with calls to defund the police. This is thinking about how are the things that we're currently sending police into communities with guns to do, are police actually the best response to those set of issues? Whether that be issues of substance abuse or homelessness and poverty, issues of mental health issues, or car accidents. You know, if you are in a car accident, it's not exactly clear why you would want somebody with a gun to arrive at the scene. Clearly, there are some alternative responses that could be effective in dealing with those situations that don't involve sending a police officer to the scene. And we should be thinking about how to reallocate the resources from a policing approach to those issues to those alternatives. So I'm going to dive into both of these, but before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the data that has been collected over the past 6 years, because what has been clear, you know, when this conversation around policing and police violence really reached the national conversation in 2014 after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, at that point, there was very little data on killings by police, let alone all of the other forms of police interactions that are often much more frequent. In that time, we and many other organizations have built databases to actually track what wasn't being tracked federally or at any other level of government. And so there are 3 databases right now that track killings by police comprehensively. One is the Washington Post's database, which only tracks on-duty police shootings that are fatal. So if you are killed by a police chokehold, you're not in their database. There is fatal encounters, which tracks a range of police encounters, both which are deaths caused by police and also deaths where police were on the scene, but somebody may have died by suicide, for example. So it's a broader definition than I think is specific to police use of force caused deaths. And then there's our database, which we launched in 2015, which is called Mapping Police Violence, which tracks people who've been killed by the police directly through police use of force. Any type of force, whether that's chokehold or weaponless force or taser or firearm. This is actually an image that was created by the New York Times using our database, Mapping Police Violence. And that is tracking the number of people killed by police each year nationwide. What you can see here is that is fairly stable over time, that this issue hasn't substantially gotten worse with regard to fatal police violence since 2013. It also hasn't gotten better, that there are about 1,100 people to 1,200 people killed by police each year in America. If we go to the next slide. So here's what's fascinating about tracking this over time and understanding the landscape of police violence and how that has changed, because our solutions, thinking about this legislatively, have to account for how this issue has evolved over time, how it affects different communities, and the legislation should address the areas where this issue is most acute and severe. And one of the things that we've seen over the past 6 years is that the geography of fatal police violence in particular has changed. And so in particular in urban communities and in large cities, there have actually been reductions in killings by police. And even when you zoom out and look at both fatal and non-fatal police shootings, there's been a decline of about 40%, 37% to be specific, in the 30 largest cities in America. However, that decline has been offset by an increase in incidents in suburban and rural communities. And so what that means is while cities, large cities, have started to take some actions, have started to implement some changes to their use of force standards, to their enforcement of low-level offenses and marijuana possession, to oversight structures, to a range of different issues, many of which have been prompted by DOJ intervention, for example, in Baltimore. But while that has happened in big cities, many of those changes have yet to be scaled to rural and suburban communities. And so the role of state legislation is essentially to take what is working in some places and then scale that through state legislation across the board so that those reductions can be felt statewide. And if we go to the next slide. This is an illustration of the 3 databases tracking this decline in the 30 largest cities. They all show a decline to varying degrees. We could go to the next slide. So this is a map of just the stability of police violence over time. This is a calendar of 2019. There were only 27 days in 2019 where somebody was not killed by the police, on average between 3 and 4 killings every single day. In 2020, there have actually been more killings by police in the first 6 months of 2020 than in that 6-month period for any prior year that we track, going all the way back to 2013. So it certainly hasn't gotten better. If we could go to the next slide. And then we also wanted to understand racial disparities. How are different communities impacted by this violence? We found that Black people are about 3 times more likely to be killed by police, more likely to be unarmed. If we go to the next slide. And also what has been interesting is seeing that levels of police violence differ substantially by jurisdiction. And so we mapped the 100 largest cities rates of killings by police per population from 2013 through 2019. This is at mappingpoliceviolence.org, a site which I launched. And this shows that in particular departments, year over year, they have higher rates of police violence than other departments. And of the 100 largest cities, there's only one department, Irvine, California, that has had 0 police killings during that time frame. What you can see in the chart on your right is a visualization of unarmed people killed by police, coded by race. The red squares are unarmed Black people killed by the police, orange squares, unarmed Latinos, and gray squares, unarmed white people. What this shows quite clearly is the vast majority of unarmed people killed by police in major cities are Black or brown, the majority of whom are Black. And so now that we have the data, we can start to understand and untease the types of factors that contribute to these outcomes. We can start to answer questions about why is it that cities like St. Louis and Oklahoma City, Phoenix, Spokane, Bakersfield, Tulsa, places like Orlando, Florida, why do they have higher rates of police violence than the national average? And why do some cities have lower rates? Places like Detroit, for example. And if we could go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the narratives and explanations that have been offered over the years to help explain some of these disparities. There is one narrative that is quite ubiquitous, and many of you have probably encountered this. That is a narrative about crime. And the narrative goes something like this, that particular cities have high rates of police violence or large racial disparities in police violence because police are being called into communities with high rates of violent crime and encountering violent people and having to defend themselves or others from harm. That's sort of the narrative that you hear. That is a narrative that goes sort of all the way from police unions and conservatives to police chiefs in some cases. And what is clear when you look at the data, these are the 50 largest cities' rates of police violence, along with rates of violent crime from 2013 through 18, which is the most recent year we have UCR violent crime data available. What you can see here is it's not clear that there's a connection. That in fact, the cities with the highest rates of violent crime are represented by the blue X's, are not necessarily the cities with the highest rates of killings by police. And that there are cities with very high rates of violent crime like Detroit that have relatively low rates of killings by police, and also cities with relatively high rates of police violence that have relatively low rates of violent crime. Cities like Columbus or even Long Beach or Mesa, Arizona. So something else is explaining why police in some circumstances that are identical to police in other circumstances are responding with more force and more violence than other police departments. And that comes down to the policies, the practices, the culture, and the approach of that law enforcement agency. So if we could go to the next slide. Just really quick, thinking about accountability. Functionally, the criminal justice system does not hold officers accountable in almost every case. So in 99% of all cases where somebody's killed by a police officer, no officers are charged. In only about 0.3% of cases, about 1 in every 300 cases, an officer is convicted of a crime. Officers who are convicted get lesser sentences than civilians convicted of the same crimes. So functionally, the criminal justice system just does not hold officers accountable in almost any case. These cases then tend to be adjudicated through the administrative processes. Those processes are governed by law enforcement officer Bill of Rights laws and police union contracts, which I'm going to get into in a second. Next slide. So this is really interesting. This is actually a visualization and analysis that was done by the Invisible Institute and the Intercept. They got access to every record of police use of force, both fatal and non-fatal, every misconduct allegation, whether sustained or unsustained, and every lawsuit against police, including the names of officers, including their personnel files, everything for Chicago Police Department over 17 years. That includes records on over 30,000 law enforcement officers. Now, you can't do this in Maryland because these records are considered confidential. They're not made public. Which is an issue that I'm going to talk about in a second. But when you can get access to the data, you can do a different type of analysis and design different types of interventions to address this issue. What they found in Chicago when they got the data was that of those 30,000 officers, there was a smaller group of about 1,300 officers. And those officers had much higher rates of use of force, much higher rates of being named in a misconduct complaint, and much higher likelihood of being involved in a misconduct lawsuit. What they also found was that over that 17-year period, as new recruits and officers were assigned to the same patrols, assigned to be under the supervision of those officers that had higher rates of misconduct, that those newer officers would begin to be socialized in a culture of violence and then begin to display that same behavior down the road. What that means is, and this is actually using epidemiological models, just like contact tracing around COVID, for example. What researchers can do when you can get access to the data is actually contact trace police violence. And what they found is if you are in proximity, close proximity to an officer that has a higher rate of misconduct, you can actually predict that that officer that was in closer proximity down the road will be 5 times more likely to use force, 6 times more likely to shoot somebody, and more likely to be named in a misconduct complaint. Which means that we can design interventions differently. We can think about early intervention systems and early warning systems differently and intervene on the front end before and remove those officers from the force before they contribute to spreading that behavior across the department, ending up with a much larger issue of misconduct within a department. All of that requires the data. It requires it not being confidential. It requires the ability of police chiefs and oversight structures to hold those officers accountable and remove them from the force without them then getting reinstated because of a variety of different processes in law enforcement officer Bill of Rights laws and police union contracts. Many of those things require state legislation to actually enable. So if we could go to the next slide. When I co-founded Campaign Zero in 2015, we looked at the data, we looked at the range of policy solutions from the Obama administration's task force report, from PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum's 30 guidelines, from a range of different organizers across the field, and grouped them all within these 10 broad categories. Since then, we have done deeper dive focuses on particular areas where there is the strongest research evidence of effectiveness. One of those areas involves police union contracts and law enforcement officer Bill of Rights laws. If we could go to the next slide. So we did a visualization of the 15 states that have police Bill of Rights laws. This is a visualization of 6 ways in which those laws impact the accountability process. Maryland is one of those states. It has one of the most extreme law enforcement officer Bill of Rights laws. But before even diving into this, it's important to note that there are only 15 states that have these laws, which means 35 states do not have these laws on the books. It is not the end of the world. Officers are not in more danger. There are not higher crime rates in states that don't have these police Bill of Rights laws. But there's a reason why these laws often make it more difficult to hold officers accountable. So if we go to the next slide. So here's an example from Maryland's Police Bill of Rights law. It says that a law enforcement agency may have expunged from any file the record of a formal complaint made against them if the complaint is exonerated, if the complaint is unsustained or unfounded, and if at least 3 years have passed since that disposition. Now, what does that mean? Nationwide, only 7% of excessive force allegations are sustained, meaning that after the police essentially investigate themselves in most places, some places you have community oversight boards, but in most places, the police investigate themselves. They determined that there was not sufficient evidence of misconduct, and they ruled that this was not a sustained complaint, which means in 93% of cases where people report some version of misconduct, they say that misconduct occurred, excessive force occurred. In 93% of those cases, all of that evidence would be wiped from the officer's record after 3 years. Now, I showed you that visualization of Chicago. That analysis was possible because they got access to 17 years of data. And when you can get access to data over that time frame, when it's not being purged or removed systematically, you can begin to identify those officers that have a pattern of misconduct on their records. Most of that misconduct is not sustained. It is often after you can establish that pattern that it even makes it possible to sustain an allegation because of just the high burden of evidence in these investigations to actually sustain a complaint, let alone result in any type of accountability. Which means under this Police Bill of Rights law in Maryland, the vast majority of evidence that would be needed to establish these patterns, to intervene and remove officers from the force who have the biggest records of misconduct, that evidence is being systematically purged because of state law. So that has to be addressed. There are other aspects of the Police Bill of Rights law that are also very problematic. For example, the waiting period, I believe it's been reduced to 5 days now, where an officer gets 5 days after a misconduct incident before they can be interrogated about it, which allows them to work with their lawyer, review all the evidence around the case, including body camera footage in many places, and then sort of get their story straight in a way that that civilians generally don't get access to. You know, if I commit a crime tomorrow, I'm probably going to be arrested for it and interrogated for it immediately. And that interrogation is not going to go in the way that it goes for an officer, where they get access to rest breaks and meal breaks, and they can't be subject to particular language or questioning by multiple people at the same time. All of those protections are given to law enforcement officers under investigation. What we're saying is, if you believe that those protections are essential to preserving the efficacy of that investigation, that those protections should then be provided to every person in the community, regardless of whether you're a police officer or not. Short of that, these protections should be repealed. Now, if we go to the next slide. Actually, the next slide after this. So Maryland has actually implemented a rudimentary data collection program around police use of force. This is what that looks like. So in a law, I believe it was passed in 2015 or 16 that amended the Police Bill of Rights law. It included a number of other provisions. One of those required law enforcement agencies in Maryland to report data on incidents that cause serious injury or death by law enforcement officers, complaints of excessive force that were sustained. Again, that's only 7% of all complaints nationwide, and complaints of criminal misconduct that have been sustained, and criminal charges filed against an officer. Again, criminal charges is very rare. So this is what that looks like. We've actually done public records requests to agencies all across the state to get access to this data. Many agencies did not comply with that law and just haven't reported any data. For those that do, the data looks like this. It is not very helpful. This is very different than the robust data collection systems that have been put in place in many other states, most notably in California. So in California, under AB 953, a bill that was signed in 2015, every law enforcement agency in the state is required to report data on every stop that they make, whether pedestrian or a traffic stop, any action that happens during those stops, whether they used force, what type of force they used, did they conduct a search, what type of search was it, did they seize property, did they arrest the person, if so, for what were the demographics of the person that were stopped. They even include whether the person was perceived to be LGBT, whether the person was perceived to be gender nonconforming, whether they perceived to have a disability, which allows for a different level of analysis of potential racial profiling than is possible in other states. That data is published online. It is individualized data. It is not just these aggregate numbers. It is individualized data that allows for analyses that are far more robust, that can identify issues not only at the department level, but even at the unit level or the police beat level, at the address level, so we can identify which blocks are most likely to have police use force, which blocks are most likely to have misconduct reported, which just allows for a different level of intervention at the local and state and even federal level. So again, AB 953 is the bill in California that should be, frankly, replicated in every state. But there are a number of other measures that have been taken by states through legislation that are very important, can make a big difference according to the research that I'm going to lift up. If we could go to the next slide. So states where misconduct is public. This is really important. I mentioned that Maryland officer personnel files, information about officer misconduct is confidential. It is not made public. That makes it very hard for people like me and community organizations, community oversight organizations, to even understand and get access to data that would establish which officers have the biggest records of misconduct, how often a department actually holds them accountable, and evaluate levels of accountability across departments. But that doesn't have to be the case. There are 12 states, in fact, now 13 states, because New York just repealed 50A, that where police misconduct records, including both sustained and unsustained or unfounded or pending allegations, are made public. That allows for a very different level of analysis that just can't be done right now in Maryland without changing the law. If it's good enough for Florida or Alabama or Georgia or Connecticut or Maine or Ohio, there's no reason it can't be good enough for Maryland as well. If we go to the next slide. There are a couple of other laws that have been passed that are really important here. And just thinking about the scope of laws, again, there are these two buckets: reducing the power of the police and shrinking the role of the police. Now, there are other pieces of legislation that have been passed that don't necessarily reduce the power of the police, and in fact, direct more money to police departments without the relevant accountability measures to make sure that that money is used in ways that are actually consistent with public safety. So training is a big area that is grouped within that category, for example, where there's no evidence that is conclusive that training in general is a path for reducing police use of force. Part of that is methodological challenges around it. So there are many different training curricula, there are many different training programs. They're implemented in different ways by different organizations or agencies across the country. And so without that uniformity, it's very difficult to evaluate the efficacy of various trainings. And so this is not a sort of evidence-based approach. We recognize that training is important, that if you have standards, they have to be, officers have to be trained on how to meet those standards. But it is very difficult to identify this particular training or this implicit bias training or this crisis intervention training is the training that is evidence-based and can reduce police use of force in these incidents. We just simply don't have the research to determine that. And so if you're thinking about which types of legislation have the strongest evidence of effectiveness, they tend to involve issues of accountability, So repealing police officer Bill of Rights laws, repealing provisions like those that are in police union contracts. There's a whole rich literature that has been produced now that shows that states and cities that have issues in their police union contracts or in police Bill of Rights laws are less likely to hold officers accountable, are more likely to have incidents of fatal police violence, particularly against unarmed people, have larger racial disparities, and are more likely to be reported for misconduct. So there's a lot of research that area of the work, the accountability structure, is a really important area for states to focus on. And so there are some things that have been done in Connecticut, for example, all the way back in 2015. Connecticut passed legislation that did an incredible job of creating a system whereby officers who are fired or who resign under investigation for misconduct are prohibited from being rehired within the state. So what this does is it addresses this issue of officers sort of cycling through agencies, even if they have these records of misconduct, and instead says, if you committed this misconduct or resigned under investigation for a whole variety of classes of misconduct, ranging from excessive force to official dishonesty and other serious forms of misconduct, you cannot be rehired within the state. That is one piece that can strengthen accountability structures. Similarly, DC just passed legislation that removes all issues of discipline, all matters of discipline from the purview of police union contract negotiations. This is huge. Nebraska actually took action recently that does something similar around this in the state. But this is an area where the state has to not only lead by addressing the statewide Police Bill of Rights law, but recognize that many of those provisions are also in effect in local police union contracts. And so those changes also should prohibit those contracts from involving a range of different issues that are identified, and you can actually scroll through and read through them at our website at checkthepolice.org. But they range from deleting records of police misconduct to imposing these artificial delays on when you can interrogate officers, to allowing officers to get their jobs back after they've been disciplined or fired, to restricting the power of community oversight structures to investigate and adjudicate issues of police misconduct. Also in the accountability category, Colorado passed legislation essentially abolishing qualified immunity at the state level. This is something that you can do. So you don't have to rely on the US Supreme Court or Congress to take action on qualified immunity. You can take action right away to remove the ability of police officers who've been found to have violated the Constitution to then escape any type of liability, and the department to escape any type of liability for actually having to compensate families for the trauma and the violence that they've experienced through these acts. So that's limiting the power of police. That also involves strengthening use of force standards, a lot of which has happened in places like Colorado and California. But also we have to talk about addressing police funding and scaling up alternative approaches to issues like mental health crises, to issues like homelessness and poverty and substance abuse that police are currently being called in to respond to. A New York Times analysis of police calls for service data found that even in places all across the country, big cities, places like Baltimore, less than 1% of all calls for service are actually involving a violent crime. Similarly, only about 4% of the total amount of time that police spend on a typical shift involves violent crime. The vast majority of what police are being called to respond to are things that you do not need somebody with a gun to respond to, things that you do not need a police officer to respond to, and things that there are experts in dealing with issues like mental health, issues like poverty and homelessness, who should be the ones to respond to those issues instead of the police. What California is doing through the Crises Act, which is AB 2053, is creating a grant funding program that would fund and scale those approaches within the state. So that's big picture, some of the things that we're seeing in states across the country. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but I'm happy to answer any questions about them.
Thank you. Our first question will come from Delegate Sample Hughes and then Delegate Moon. Speaker Pro Tem Sample Hughes.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Sunway, for your presentation today. It certainly has been very informative. My question is that you've had within your slide where you've done a 6-year look back at research in this space. But you had one in particular that looked at the rural, suburban, and urban, how police killings and crime has gone up. Looking at that bit of information, I'm sure there's many things that goes behind or tells the story of why things have increased or decreased. But when you had also mentioned that you had the information from the task force with Obama's task force, does that interplay with some of your research as far as the T3 that was discussed as a best practice? And also, I think one of the issues that was brought up, or potential things that were brought up, dealt with customer feedback and zip codes of where things may have occurred. I was just curious, were there any of those best practices used specifically in the rural areas that may have changed that chart of where the increase had occurred in the rural community?
Great question. So there's still a lot we don't understand about why rates of killings by police are going up in rural communities. And when you look at the data, in suburban communities, the increase, a big part of that increase is an increase among Latinos who are being killed by police in suburban areas. Part of this might reflect changes in demographic trends as the suburbs become more diverse. But in rural communities, it tends to be an increase actually among white men in particular, who are being more likely to be killed by police in rural communities over time. And we're not sure why that is. This is a new finding. We just actually disaggregated this data by geography, or rural, urban, suburban, just a few months ago, and are trying to better understand what is driving these trends. What does appear to be happening in cities, though, is that it's the cities that have had either activist-led intervention or Department of Justice intervention that have seen those reductions. So activist-led intervention means that they had widespread protests, a lot of pressure on city council members and mayors that have then adopted changes to their use of force policies, have adopted stronger community oversight models, have begun to pilot a different approach to low-level offenses, so they're reducing arrests for low-level offenses. And those have been some of the practices that in those cities that have done those things, they've seen the largest reductions. Again, the rural question is a huge thing that a number of researchers, we're looking at. I know the Vera Institute is looking at, trying to better understand why those trajectories are the way that they are. But I think what is interesting about this is, I think often when we depict this at the national level, it looks like a flat trend line. It looks like nothing is making a difference. But when you zoom in, what is clear is in particular places, substantial progress is being made. And I'll give you an example. Oakland, California has had between 7 and 8 police shootings, both fatal and non-fatal on average, every single year over the past, more than the past decade, all the way up until about 2013. And then their rates dropped dramatically. And over the past several years, they've averaged between 0 and 1 police shooting a year, which is a 90% reduction. Now, what did they do? The crime rates have stayed the same. It didn't take a massive shift in anything that communities did differently around crime. The police changed. And the police changed in part because they adopted stronger use of force policies. They adopted one of the most powerful oversight structures in the country through Measure LL, which is one of the only community oversight boards that has the power not only to independently investigate police complaints, not only to subpoena officers and get access to all of the documentation and evidence, but also they have the power to discipline officers, which is something that is very rare in cities across the country, but is in place in Oakland. Oakland also had federal intervention, and so many of these changes were mandated. It's not like they just voluntarily decided to do these things. And Oakland has begun to pilot a team of mental health providers instead of police officers who responds to particular calls, and begun to scale up that approach. So many of the things that I've talked about have been put in place in Oakland, and we're seeing results. Now, again, there remain a lot of issues in Oakland. There's still racial disparities in arrests for drug offenses, still issues with underreporting of non-lethal force. But clearly there have been substantial changes that have saved lives in Oakland. And the question is, how are we learning from what is working in some places and then scaling that across the country through state legislation in all 50 states?
Thank you. Next, Delegate Moon. And then we'll have Delegate Acebero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks for joining us, Samuel. I caught some of your research compilations on Twitter, so I'm intrigued to be able to follow up in person now. But I just want to, I guess, ask for a little bit more concrete steps or places to go for what to do next on this whole business of shrinking the role of police. Because I'll note that, you know, almost every single one of the people that spoke today, including you, has pointed to some role there. And in some ways, the other bucket, the police accountability bucket, is a more defined conversation here in Maryland. This will be the second work group we've done on it. There are multiple bills with very specific asks for what police discipline and things like that look like. But this other part about, you know, mental health and shrinking the role and all that, to me, it's a very unformed view. I mean, I've seen the stuff about Eugene, and like I mentioned earlier, my county and some others in Maryland, we've already done this whole pilot thing. We've hired like 2 people. You know, some counties claim to have a 24/7 alternative to policing for these types of calls. And yet also in my county, the last 3 police shootings in my district were all people with behavioral health issues. They were all Black, and there's questions of profiling in some of them. So they're not the kinds of cases that are police discipline cases, right? The police are going to say they did the right thing. And in reviewing the tapes of those shootings, they in fact did say they did the right thing. And I'm certain that, you know, any prosecutor that would look at those cases would say there's not a crime here. And yet the result is not good. So we've done the pilot thing. It sounds like that's what California is embarking on. And I guess other than, you know, a sort of scale up, I mean, I guess I'm just keen to see if we can leave here with some ideas on, you know, what we can do to get this going as a much more real policy. And also, if you could just comment on whether we can get away with sort of dealing with this issue and only doing the accountability piece, you know, whether that makes sense.
Great question. So again, with the alternatives to the police conversation, it is something that is less formed, in part because it is an approach that many cities and states have sort of not really engaged in until relatively recently. So the programs that do exist tend to be newer. They tend to be in pilot stage. So bringing this to scale is something that is going to take further insights. It's going to take a community of practice around this all across the country. It's going to take questions around how do you logistically engage in these things. So I'll give you an example. In Portland, I met with the city council members in Portland, and one of the things that as they're considering implementing this mental health first responder model, their questions were, you know, what types of calls do we send them to? Because sometimes there's ambiguity around what is actually going on when you get those calls. What happens if somebody has a mental health crisis, but they also have a gun or a knife, for example? Where do you sort of draw the line between sending a mental health provider, sending a co-responder model with a police officer sort of plays backup, and the mental health responder who is sort of leading the interaction? And then which cases might you send a police officer? And there's no clear-cut sort of rule around this, and different places do it differently. In Portland, for example, they're thinking about housing the mental health providers in fire stations across the city, because the city just operates these fire stations. It's not in the police station where there might be a conflict of interest. And so that's where they're thinking about housing them. That's a different approach than other cities are thinking about. And then there's a whole logistical question around, you know, how do you build this out at scale? How do you build essentially a new system, a new institution? And obviously that takes time. And there will be a learning process along the way. There will be things that work that don't work. There will probably be examples where you get it wrong. And I think that is true. At the same time, I think to get started, one of the first things that's important is to begin with the analysis of calls for service data. To begin by understanding what are the broad groups of calls for service data where we can just send somebody else or not send anybody. So for example, car accidents are a good one. There's no good reason to send a police officer to the scene of a car accident. Similarly, a situation that is a non-criminal call for service or a welfare check. Those are some other areas where it can make sense to immediately begin there and then start phasing up over time. And then, I'll acknowledge that there are some pipeline issues as well, right? It's not like there's an unlimited supply of social workers or mental health providers. And just like there aren't many cops who are trained in crisis intervention, there actually aren't that many mental health providers and social workers out there who we can recruit for this, because the pipeline there have been a number of pipeline issues. Are there Black and brown social workers and mental health providers who can respond to communities, or are we going to be dealing with many of the same equity issues that we're also dealing with in policing as well? So I think that there are a lot of issues that we have to work through. I think to get it started, it is going to take being able to pilot these in multiple cities, scale it up to the greatest extent possible to deal with as many of those calls for service as possible, and create a public accountability process for that, because even getting access to calls for service data in many cities is very hard. So many cities don't post this online. They don't do their own analysis or post any analysis of which of these calls for service do we think might form a good candidate for initially deploying an alternative. There isn't a census of or a statewide census of the various alternatives that exist, and what are the challenges that they're going through to scale. So again, this is going to require a lot of different actions. It's going to require strengthening the base of mental health providers, social workers, and making sure that they are equipped to respond and they have the capacity to respond to this many calls. It's going to take a analysis within cities that can be encouraged by state legislation to put that data out there on calls for service and conduct analyses that are clear, that provide a roadmap for the types of calls that they're going to be diverting, whether or not they're actually doing that work, and what are phase 2, 3, and 4 for sort of phasing down the policing approach to these particular issues. So I don't think this is easy. I agree that there are many questions that we simply don't have the answers to, in part because this is new in many places. But I think we can put in place the structures to begin scaling up and evaluating what is working, to be evaluating the issues, to scale it to the logistical and other issues, to implementing these models, and then building a community of practice around strengthening those models and scaling them over time.
Okay, Delegate Acevedo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Sam, for your presentation. My question relates to police settlements and how they're paid out. I know you covered quite a bit in your presentation, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on police settlements. We see right here in Maryland with the killing of Corin Gaines in Baltimore County that the county is stuck with a $38 million lawsuit. Baltimore City has paid since 2015 over $12 million in police settlements, and we see this in jurisdictions across our state and country. And I'm curious to find out your thoughts on obviously changing the model and the ways in which we pay out these police settlements, and instead of communities and payments coming out of operating budgets, that we start paying out police settlements out of police and sheriff departments budgets, so to ensure that we as a community aren't seeing these resources that would otherwise go to schools, hospitals, etc., being paid as sort of like blood money in a sense. So we'd love to get your thoughts on that, and also how that ties into the whole divestment discussion, because what we know, like nationally, we spend around $115 billion on law enforcement, more than any other country, save for China, spends on military. As a state, Maryland, we spend over $2 billion on our state police and corrections. And just speaking for my county, we spend around $300 million on our police department. So if we could sort of delve into the divestment discussion, but also focusing on police settlements and how those are paid out.
Yeah, so, and I can share this with you, I guess, through Delegate Atterbury. But there's a study that's recently been done by Professor Joanna Schwartz at UCLA, and she looks into the process by which the largest cities in the country, I believe it's the 80 or 100 largest cities, how they pay out police misconduct settlements. And what's interesting about it is there are a number of cities that actually do require this money to come out of police department budgets. Chicago is one of those cities, for example. The problem is when they do that, they tend to have processes that sort of backfill or fill back in the amount of money that police departments are paying in those settlements and sort of cover the tab through the city fund. So what that means is even if you adopt a law that requires the money to come out of a police department budget, you'll want to make sure that they can't sort of do a workaround for that law by creating a separate fund, for example, specific to police misconduct settlements. And when that fund is spent, they just replenish the fund. And so there are a number of things that you'll want to pay attention to in that broader conversation. I think it is spot on that that the money should be coming out of police department budgets. It shouldn't be that that's coming out of programs and services that the community vitally needs. The police should actually be held accountable financially for the damage that they cause. Now, the process and the legislation, what does that look like to make that happen? I think has to account for the ways in which cities, even that ostensibly require this, have sort of found a way to work around that. So I can send you that research to look at. I think the second piece broadly about this conversation about police budgets and police funding is to recognize that the biggest drivers of police budgets are not sort of what's most commonly thought about. So most people think that this is about that the police budget is so big because they're paying so much money on buying MRAP, armored personnel carriers, and assault rifles and other militarized equipment. And a lot of money for the SWAT team. It turns out that the police department budget, about 85% of the police department budget on average, according to the Police Executive Research Forum, is spent on personnel costs. So officer pay, salary, benefits, overtime. And so if we want to cut the police department budget, if we want to reallocate funding from police departments to communities, we're talking about money that will reduce the size of the force and that will scale up alternative responders to be those responders instead. And the process for doing that is also structured by police union contracts and in some cases state law. So right now, if you look at communities that are pushing for cutting the police budget, reallocating that funding, one of the core demands has been that when you reduce the size of the force, the officers who should get removed from the force first should be the officers with the biggest records of misconduct. And yet, when you look at the police union contracts and labor laws in many states, it requires that these layoffs be in order of officer seniority. So if you can only remove officers in order of officer seniority, what you're going to be doing is removing younger officers, disproportionately Black and brown officers from the force, and keeping the officers who are older, who tend to be disproportionately white and male, who've been ingrained in sort of a toxic police culture for so long, who are the officers who tend to have those records of misconduct that I talked about, who've been around for a while. Those officers stay on the force still, which is not itself a solution. So in other places, for example, in Louisville, in their contract, their police union contract, it says there can be no layoffs during the term of this agreement, which means you really can't really cut the size of the police force at all until you change the police union contract anyway, in many of those cities. So much of this conversation about shifting the role of the police, about reducing the size of the force, even about scaling up alternatives, which, for example, in Portland, they want to implement this street response team, these unarmed mental health providers. The police union has said that because of our collective bargaining agreement in Portland, you can only implement 5 units of this. And if you go beyond 5 units, it's subject to the collective bargaining process. So everything is being structured by a process by which police unions essentially have veto power over reducing the size of the force, over reducing the police budget, over creating and scaling up alternatives, over changing issues of accountability within those contracts, which essentially structure the accountability system, over the whole conversation. So we have to be serious about, and I know this is tough politically because it does impact unions and police unions are particularly powerful. but we can't get to any of these things until we take action to address and reduce the power of the police unions specifically. And that is a big piece of this that just has to be called out. Is tough, but it has to be a part of this work if we're going to implement these changes.
Thanks, and agreed on the LEOBR piece. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Anderson, and then Delegate Buckle. You're on mute. Hold on one second, Delegate Anderson. There you go.
Okay. And Samuel, thanks again for giving us your time today. My question is still on the line of what you were just talking about with regard to police unions and their contracts. So let's say that we do pass some bills that change what's already negotiated in a contract. Can that be done legally? In other words, we pass something that affects what's currently in a collective bargaining agreement. My question is, when that has happened in other states, have those laws been found to be constitutional, or do we have to wait until the contract expires?
Great question. So I apologize for the noise. I don't know what's happening outside, but so with these agreements, there have been 2 states that have taken this on one state, and one should be a state, but is not yet a state, which is DC, that have taken this on in a big way. In DC, they passed legislation, and this is recent legislation, that removes all matters of discipline from the purview of collective bargaining agreements between police unions and city. In Nebraska, they signed legislation which is a different approach, which specifically bars police union contracts from having provisions that do things like that purge records of police misconduct, that prevent officers from being interrogated immediately after an incident, that very specifically calls out the types of things that I've mentioned and says a contract cannot have those things in it specifically. Those are 2 different approaches that have been taken. Neither of those have been challenged in the courts as of yet. But it is a challenge. I think it will depend, because this is sort of an area that has not yet been challenged in the courts. I can't cite previous examples where
okay, so in DC,
effect in those jurisdictions right now.
Okay, so in DC, when they passed that law, did that end? Did the lack of, or did that end in practice at that time, or did it have to wait until the current contract expired before it went into effect? Do you know?
Yes. So it waits until the current contract expires, and then it takes effect with the new contract.
Okay. My last question is,
expire every 3 or 4 years. So again, there will be some lead time before it takes effect all across the state, but that's how they've been structured.
Okay. Last question. You mentioned that in Oakland, there were federal mandates that they had to go by, which helped with their problems there. As you know, in Baltimore, we're currently under a federal consent decree, and the police department was required to come up with a use of force protocol. And are you familiar with Baltimore's use of force protocol now?
Yes.
Okay. How does that stack up against what you would like to see in the ideal use of force protocol?
Yeah, great question. So, Baltimore has changed its use of force procedures, its policies in response to that federal intervention. It has strengthened it substantially. We've looked at use of force policies across the country in the 100 largest cities. And right now, Baltimore's policy is fairly restrictive compared to other departments. It is more restrictive than the average policy. There are some departments that go further. So San Francisco's policy is more restrictive than Baltimore's, for example, and I can send you a copy of that. I think the big area where change is needed with regard to Baltimore, a number of areas, but is really around accountability and then around the role of the police. I think they have done some work establishing stronger standards around use of force. But if those standards aren't enforced through accountability structures that can hold officers accountable to that, then the standards themselves just become words on a piece of paper, right? And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to strengthen community oversight to change the LEOBR and the police union contract in Baltimore, both of which impact the accountability process. And also to be scaling up programs ranging from safe streets to other programs that can address broader issues of crime and safety without it being a policing response. So I think those are the areas, for Baltimore in particular, that I think a lot of progress needs to be made. Changing the use of force policy is often a first step because it can be done immediately. You can rewrite that, but then actually implementing that, making sure that it's enforced, making sure that we're addressing some of these other systemic factors is often what takes a little bit more time.
The court in Georgia, when it was looking at that case with, what was his name? Sergeant Walker in DeKalb County, who used deadly force, killed Anthony Hill. They found that Georgia did not have a code of conduct in law, and therefore the police officer could not be convicted of that and not held accountable. Are there states that have codes of conduct in the law that can be looked at by everybody in terms of whether or not or how to hold a police officer accountable?
Yes. So usually this takes place in the context of deadly force policies or other use of force laws that create clear prohibitions on the use of particular tactics. I know the first presentation that we heard went into some states that have taken action to, for example, ban things like chokeholds and strangleholds at the state level, or create an enforceable crime, essentially, that you can prosecute police if they use these tactics. There are some states that have much more restrictive deadly force laws than others. So, for example, Tennessee is one of the only states, one of 4 states, that specifically has a law requiring police to exhaust all alternatives available to them prior to using deadly force. That is not the current standard, for example, in Maryland or most states. It goes further than the sort of minimum standards set by the Supreme Court through Tennessee v. Garner and Graham v. Connor, which essentially say that the police can use deadly force whenever they deem it to be reasonable in response to a particular type of incident. Usually it's an incident where the officer perceives a threat of death or serious injury. It doesn't require officers to use de-escalation or exhaust all of the other tactics available to them that could effectively deal with that incident. It just asks whether that incident, whether there was a sufficient threat, therefore the officer could have been deemed to act reasonably. Tennessee goes further than that by, in fact, creating an affirmative requirement that officers exhaust all their options available to them. Many other states ban things like chokeholds and strangleholds. Some places have begun to ban shooting at moving vehicles, which is another category of deadly force. That so there are 62 people who died, who were killed by police last year alone, who were shot by police when they were in a vehicle. This is something that the Department of Justice, the Police Executive Research Forum, a number of groups have said should just be banned entirely because it creates danger not only to the person in the car who's being shot at, but potentially passengers. The bullet could hit a pedestrian or a crowd or ricochet off the car. If you hit the car, then the car could just careen into a crowd or a building. It just creates a whole level of risk that is even higher than other shootings. But there are a set of things that states can take action on to restrict and create enforceable codes of conduct, including duty to intervene and all the other things that I mentioned. States should do that. But again, I think you have to have enforcement. You have to make sure that administratively, which is where most of these cases get adjudicated. Again, it's very rare that an officer will be charged, even in states that have stronger standards. And so most, if not all of these incidents tend to get adjudicated administratively. And that's when the LEOBR comes into play. That's when the union contract comes into play. And so without addressing those, in the vast majority of cases, you're still not gonna have the tools to effectively hold the police accountable.
Thank you.
Delegate Buckle.
Is that working?
Yes, there you go.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your time this afternoon. You've given us quite a lot of information. There's probably a lot of things that in a different format we probably would and could and should dig into a little bit deeper. But I just had kind of one point, because you said it a couple different times and it was sort of jarring to me, and then one question. And the point was, I practice law for a living, a wide variety of civil litigation, not really criminal. And you said a couple of times, why should we call the police to a traffic accident? Why should the police be involved in a traffic accident? And I would suggest to you, and for the benefit of the people involved in this, there's about 1,000 good reasons why police should be called to a traffic accident. Sometimes they're called to a traffic accident because the accident is blocking other traffic. And if police don't come who are trained in how to divert and direct traffic and how to assess that, other accidents happen and people get hurt because folks who aren't trained are standing around in the middle of a highway or an intersection because they're dazed or they're upset or they're concerned. So police have a very good understanding of how to direct traffic in accidents. And secondly, because they create things called police reports that those of us who are attorneys use very, very much to assess potentially who was at fault in the accident. Very seldom does someone cause an automobile accident and jump out of the car and go, oh yeah, that was me. I was speeding, I turned the wrong way and hurt that guy or killed that guy. That's, some people do that, but most of the time it requires a neutral, objective, third-party observer to get there quick and kind of put some of the statements and facts together. So I'll just throw that out there, why we call police to respond to traffic accidents. The question that I had for you was, we talked a lot here in the last few minutes about police unions. Is it your position or suggestion that we should eliminate police unions and collective bargaining, or that there can be some limitations? You mentioned some states that suggest you can limit their ability to collectively bargain over disciplinary processes or procedures. To me, that would be very different than eliminating their collective bargaining ability to bargain about workforce, manpower, whatever you want to call it, requirements, retirement requirements, things of that nature. And I'm not aware of any other state or local government employees who have their collective bargaining rights so limited that they can't lock themselves into those types of terms. Are you suggesting we go in that direction, or would it be enough to simply take away their ability to control the disciplinary process through the collective bargaining agreement?
Great questions. So to your first point about the traffic accidents, I have no doubt that somebody should be sent to the scene. That person should be able to direct traffic and manage the public safety issues regarding the flow of traffic. They should be able to document what happened. I don't think that person needs a gun, right? And I think that the core of this is, does the person on the scene really need a gun? I think you look at what communities like Berkeley are doing, where they just actually enacted legislation in Berkeley that's going to remove the police from traffic enforcement. What they're going to do is create a different unit that is going to be unarmed, that will be civil servants who respond to those units in the way that you described, but just will not be sort of armed police officers. And the idea is that can de-escalate the tension, not only for car accidents, but traffic enforcement in general. Because I think if you get stopped by the police and you know that person's coming over, they have a gun, it's just a different environment for both the officer and the person stopped. And so trying to de-escalate those tensions, de-escalate those situations is really important. Now, the second piece around collective bargaining, I think what is clear is that the police unions have quite a bit of power to shape this entire conversation, policymaking at the state and local level. And
I don't want to interrupt you, but I mean, their power comes from the politicians, right? So a collective bargaining agreement, I'm the police union for Baltimore City. The Baltimore mayor and city council have to agree to my contract, or the Prince George's County executive. Their power that you mentioned isn't some power that exists for them in law. It's the power of them to shape the political process.
Yes. And so just to give you a sense, I mean, they've already negotiated all of these things into the contract, right? The challenge now is these contracts, if you don't agree to a new contract, the old contract tends to remain in effect, which means they've locked in a system where these things are in there. And without state legislation, it is unlikely, even with the best organizing, the best sort of public awareness campaign around this, it's very hard to remove it because structurally they already have it in. In order to get it out, they would need to negotiate they would have to get some sort of concession in the negotiation sufficient to remove these huge issues. And that probably is going to mean a lot more funding for the police, right? And I think if you're torn between being able to have a police force that can be held accountable, or that has a lot more resources that get funneled from community needs, or having a smaller police force that is less funded but is not accountable, it's not clear which is better. Both of them are not good situations. And so I think, ultimately, it is going to take state legislation to remove these issues from the contract. Now, does that go as far as eliminating collective bargaining for police unions? No. Now, again, you mentioned you don't know of any states that do. There are some states that don't allow police to do collective bargaining. Many of them are very conservative states. They don't allow this in general. So it's not unheard of. It's not something that's impossible. It hasn't happened. I do think that obviously there are a whole lot of considerations to think about with that in general. What is true in particular is that there are specific areas in which those contracts obstruct the accountability process that we've identified. Not only us, there are researchers like Stephen Rushton and John Rappaport and Abdul Rad at University of Chicago Law School and many universities that have mapped out and identified all of these types of provisions and that need to be removed. And it's going to take action at the state level to remove them. It's the only way it's going to happen across the board. And so I think that has to be a part of this. There are other issues around police funding, around the role of the police that are challenging. I think it'll take a challenging, a nuanced approach that can address some of the broader issues around collective bargaining rights at the same time as they don't allow police unions to basically structure the role of the police, right? It should not be subject to bargaining whether a city wants to implement a alternative approach to traffic stops or to mental health calls. The city should be able to do that without having to pony up another $10 million for the police force. That shouldn't be the cost of doing business. And in many ways, it's sort of like hostage taking, where the city has to pay more to get basic accountability, basic constitutional protections, and a basic conceptualization of public safety that can actually keep communities safe. So we have to eliminate the power of the police unions to control those processes. I don't think that requires sort of abolishing the police unions as a whole, but I think it does require a very serious look at limiting their power to structure these processes.
Thank you.
Delegate Acevedo has a follow-up question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sam, just a quick question. So if we, as you are suggesting, were to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, would state and local government employees still have due process rights like every other state employee if we were to repeal the LEOBR?
Yes. So, I mean, the police would be like every other civil servant and have access to those protections. And it would put Maryland in line with the 35 states that don't have LEOBR. So I think this argument that you need the LEOBR in order to have due process protections for officers, I don't think that, that's not true unless you believe that none of those other states officers have due process protections. So yeah, I think that does need to be repealed. And again, many of those provisions are also in these collective bargaining agreements. So even if you repeal it at the state level, unless that includes a provision that also addresses what's happening at the local level, in many places, including Baltimore, those issues will still be a problem.
And one quick clarifying question. You are not advocating for the abolition of unions, rather the abolition of the LEOBR, correct?
That's correct. So what I think needs to happen is that fundamentally the police unions just have a power that needs to be curtailed substantially in order to get to all of these other issues. And that is a power politically, it's a power through a lot of donations and lobbying through politicians, but it's also a power that is locked in and structural with regard to the contracts and the law. And so I think both of those things have to be on the table, and we have to figure out a pathway that can address that at the scale of the problem. Because even without that, if they continue to have that power, they could just get this reenacted. In fact, in Georgia, they just enacted the statewide Police Bill of Rights law in Georgia in the past 2 weeks. In the context of everything that's been happening, no state has repealed the Police Bill of Rights law. Another state has actually enacted one. So that just goes to show you there's a lot of challenges around this, and it's going to be a fight. But I think this has to be, if we're serious about addressing this issue, we have to talk about this.
Okay, thank you, Sam. I want to thank you again for participating today and presenting to the work group, and also for being patient with us. Work group members, and for those who are joining us listening virtually, we will have a public hearing on August the 6th, beginning at 1 p.m. I would encourage the work group members to settle in, show your face live to all of those who will be taking time out to tell us their stories and share their concerns. And we will be taking incremental breaks during the hearing, and all that information will be sent out to you as well. And there are, for those that are listening, there will be instructions on how to sign up for the virtual hearing on the website, the same link that you linked up to listen to today's hearing. So thank you everyone for joining us, and that concludes today's hearing.